I looked into altered states of consciousness and different sort of experiences that can give rise to this feeling of oneness or unification that happens for some people. And I came across different experiences that could give rise to this feeling. And for example, extreme sports and states of flow, near-death experiences, and serendipity led me to the overview effect.
Hello and welcome to the Further Reaches podcast. My name is Kaz Tanner and I'm your host. Today we are going to be learning about a topic which I am absolutely fascinated in. This is the overview effect, which refers to a shift in consciousness that astronauts experience after seeing the Earth from space. Our guest today is Dr Annahita Nezami, who several years ago interviewed NASA astronauts to investigate the therapeutic benefits of the overview effect. This was part of her doctoral research. She realized that the overview effect potentially offers comparable results to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and nature-based experiences in promoting transcendence and well-being. In 2019, Annahita established Virtual Reality Overview Effect, VROE, and has been working hard since then to disseminate, study, and apply the overview effect. Annahita is a chartered counselling psychologist providing consultation, assessment, and therapy. Her areas of interest include space health, well-being, neuroscience, trauma, depression, performance, and altered states of consciousness. Here is our conversation. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Well, Annahita, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I'm really excited to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to talking with you about the overview effect and consciousness and altered states and all those things.
Amazing. So to start with, for someone who's never heard of the overview effect, what is it?
So at its core, the overview effect is actually a term that's coined by Frank White. He's a space philosopher and a futurist. And he's written a book by the same name and documented this sort of phenomenon in his book. And the way he describes it, I'm going to sort of just paraphrase his description. It refers to a cognitive shift in worldview experienced by astronauts when they view firsthand the Earth from space as a tiny, fragile ball of life. And the experience is often accompanied by feelings of awe and an understanding of the interconnection of all life and a renewed sense of responsibility for taking care of the planet. But actually, it goes beyond that as well. And so, in a way, Frank White conducted field research with lots of astronauts. I think over 30 astronauts at least, and many more. And his sort of interviews sort of helped him and other people highlight themes within the experience. So really try to understand what the experience was and sort of did a thematic analysis. But actually, over the years, what we're beginning to understand is a broader definition of the overview effect. And if we think about it, the overview effect essentially describes a psychological state that can emerge when we're witnessing remarkable natural landscapes from an expansive vantage point. And Earth gazing from orbit or the moon is the epitome of this experience. And actually, David Yaden, who's based in New York, he's a psychologist, he describes it in this way. And it's a very useful description because it allows us to understand that it is a psychological state that emerges as a result of our interaction with nature in this kind of panoptic scale. And that this engagement with nature, which is Earth, can result in a shift in consciousness or a shift in cognitive shift as well. And beyond that, I think why, and we'll probably touch on this a bit more later, but the overview effect can basically be considered an atypical method of engaging with the natural environment, which is earth and space. We don't normally, when we think of nature, we don't normally think of it as expansive space and earth as a planet. And so it's just an interesting way, to look at it. And in that way, then we can begin to sort of hypothesize or begin to predict that it offers perhaps demonstrable, maybe even enhanced benefits in terms of promoting, well-being or different aspects of well-being, or self-transcendence perhaps, or feeling of connectedness with nature, which various natural environments research has shown can do.
Beautiful. I think it's amazing that there is like such a huge difference between knowing that we exist on this planet, seeing a photograph of the planet, but then when an astronaut goes into space, they experience it so differently. These astronauts must have seen photos of the Earth before taking off. But why do you think that it's so different to physically see the Earth from space compared to just looking at a photograph of the Earth?
I think that's an amazing question. So I think there's several reasons, but I think one of the reasons is to do with that sort of direct perceptual encounter that astronauts have. A picture provides an idea, but the direct experience gives a much more vivid experience, and you have to imagine when the astronauts are talking about the experience, they're talking about how the images are moving all the time and the scene before them, the Earth is alive, basically. That's how they describe, many astronauts describe the Earth, and so it's much more vibrant, the direct experience, and for example, the context as well of being in infinite space and Earth being positioned, the backdrop is infinite space, and so you have these sort of changes in almost as you like the Earth personifies, because she presents herself in different ways to the observer. So, for example, in the day passes, Earth will come alive. She appears alone. The stars fade out in the background because of the sunlight, and Earth actually appears alone. And the more organic features of Earth come alive, and human signatures can't be seen as much. And Earth is there, bare, and sort of presenting herself. But then at the night scenes, where the night, the dark passes over Earth is much more animated, and human civilization and activity comes alive, and she seems vibrant in a different way. So really these nuances and these differences in presentation, in the scene, the motion, the movement, the colors, the deep space before them, really, a picture can't provide that in quite the same way. So it's much more profound. But also, Earth is, for the astronauts up there in space, or in orbit, or in moon landings, they basically presented with this scene. It's a constant, although they're not always Earth gazing, they're very busy, they've got things to do, but it is a constant and it is there. So they can always, this contemplative process, they can return back to Earth, view her, and then go away, process it, come back and look again. And whereas a picture is slightly different most of the time, and it's more static, although we have wonderful images from the ISS and other satellite images that are doing a great job in showing us where we are in the wider scheme of things. Finally, I think also just being able to, I think an image or a scene in terms of a video footage or a still picture doesn't quite capture the interconnectedness of what is being observed. For example, Nicole Stott, in one of my interviews for my thesis, she talked about lightning. And I had never Perhaps all those years ago, I was a bit sort of naive, but I had never sort of heard anyone describe lightning in the way that she described it. And she talked about these sort of neural networks of lightning spanning thousands of miles across the planet. And, this sort of conscious sort of energy that was sort of vibrating across the planet. And I just found that fascinating. I just didn't think of lightning in that way.
Yeah, that's so true. Because when we experience lightning, we just see like one lightning bolt and that's it. And to be honest, I hadn't really thought about how there could be like a neural network of lightning across, big parts of the planet. That's such a beautiful image. It's so fascinating that a lot of these astronauts who go to space, they come back changed. Like I know that some of them come back more focused on helping the environment, or with more humanitarian focus of what can I do to help people, to help the earth. Like being in space changes them and their priorities and the things that they think are important. So it's this like huge shift in perspective that happens. So it's so cool that you decided to study this for your PhD research. And you actually got to talk to 7 NASA astronauts, which is amazing. I don't know how many people can say that they've talked to 7 astronauts. So I'd love to hear, what did you study for your PhD? And in these interviews with the astronauts, what did you find?
Back in 2012, I was trying to sort of come up with a research idea and doctoral research sort of idea. And I was very much into altered states of consciousness. And I was very much, I was reading around Jung and Jungian psychology, and very much into, actually at that time, quantum physics, and trying to read into these sort of idea of oneness within quantum physics. And actually, this idea of oneness was something that I was very fascinated by in relation to altered states of consciousness. And that's where my sort of ideas of what I should research started. And I looked into altered states of consciousness and different sort of experiences that can give rise to this feeling of oneness or unification that happens for some people. And I came across different experiences that could give rise to this feeling. And for example, extreme sports and states of flow. I came across sort of near-death experiences. And these sort of meditation, of course. Anyway, so I was looking at these different experiences and I was looking into this feeling of oneness, and sort of serendipity led me to the overview effect. And, I was staying up till 2 a.m, reading and trying to figure out what to do. And in the panic of all of that, I think I tweeted or emailed via Twitter anyway, Frank, and said, I've come across this overview effect and I'm looking into researching, and, can we meet? Can we just have a discussion? And from there, that's sort of, we had a few meetings via Zoom, and the rest is history. And so that led to looking at the overview effect and, altered states of consciousness and the overview effect. And that's where it started. So for my doctoral research, I was, as I said, very fortunate. Frank put me in touch with some NASA astronauts, and I ended up interviewing 7 retired NASA astronauts. One was just about to retire. And really, I wanted to understand, so there's the planetary perspective and this sort of cosmic perspective, and that can give rise to something called the overview effect, which I believe to be an altered states of consciousness or a higher level of consciousness. And I really wanted to try to begin the process or the discussion around, well, what are the underlying psychological mechanisms that instigates this kind of cognitive and potentially the behavioral change that might follow? And if the experience does promote well-being, well, how does it promote well-being? What type of well-being and why? And these types of questions were important, although I couldn't address all of them, to be honest, in my thesis, but they were interesting to me. And if the experience strengthened the astronaut's emotional attachment to Earth and nature, well, why is that? Like, what actually led to that? Because obviously that's got important implications for well-being, on a personal level, but actually also planetary well-being in terms of sustainability and in terms of individual choices and behaviors that we take and how we look after the planet that we live on. And so those were sort of really important. And the results basically of the research, what the research showed complemented Frank's existing work, and also kind of gave rise to a few new areas. And I think I mentioned one of them earlier, which, for example, the different faces of Earth, the nuances of Earth that sort of came about because of this planetary perspective, and how the astronauts in my interviews commented on the dark side and the light side. And that was very important to them. The physical detachment, for example, was also very important. All of the astronauts in the NASA astronauts talked about the physical detachment they felt and how that really sort of almost hinting towards nostalgia, being untethered from the planet that you come from and live on and live with. That also led to that sense of perceived loss, because obviously, absence makes the heart grow fonder, as many people say, and in this case, that was true. And of course, being removed in that way and seeing the sort of panoptic or planetary perspective removes you as well physically from everyday problems, and so that detachment again was very important in terms of helping them focus on larger global problems, which became much more obvious because the borders and boundaries weren't as visible, and everything was in this sort of presented in a unified singularity, if you like. It was all there happening, interconnected all at once before them. Of course, the experience, and Frank has talked about this, elicited positive and transformational emotions. So emotions that we know are powerful in the field of psychology, for example, like awe, gratitude, reverence, humility, wonder. For all the astronauts I interviewed, it either strengthened virtuous disposition, so they already had these virtuous dispositions that existed within them, or it sort of I don't want to say created, these virtuous dispositions. I suspect the process was about strengthening the already existing dispositions that they had. But still, I found that very interesting. There was also a spiritual sort of aspect to the interviews. They talked about insignificance and significance together, many of the astronauts from the 7 that I interviewed would talk about feeling insignificant, but also feeling significant. For example, they made sense of the experience. Things like being in the Goldilocks zone made them, as a unit, as an individual, I am insignificant. I am potentially alone in this vast cosmic arena, and that can make me feel insignificant. But connected to the planet, connected to my species, connected to nature, connected to life, connected to the cosmos, I am larger than that. I am significant. And also the positioning of planet Earth was, for example, some of the astronauts would talk about, we're in the Goldilocks zone. Look at us, how fortunate we are, how lucky we are. So this kind of juxtaposition between insignificance and significance was important. Of course, we know that existential contemplation is important in all aspects of our life for many people. And so similarly, for the astronauts, this is sort of years after their experience for many of them, they were reflecting on existential aspects of the experience. And they also sort of felt some sort of more uncomfortable emotions. So wonder was laced with guilt and angst as well for many of them, if not, I'd say all of them actually. There was this sort of sense of remorse, this anticipated loss of something that could be bad, that could be coming, because they could see pollution, they could see droughts, they could see deforestation, they could see these things from this sort of panoptic, these environmental issues, and that really led to these feelings of angst. But familiarity was important. As I said, there is a sort of personification of Earth where they're going round Earth. I think there's 16 sunrises and sunsets in 24 hours. So they're just going round Earth, and they're seeing all of these sunsets and sunrises, and then getting to learn about Earth's nuances, and they're understanding more about their home planet and places of interest. But this sort of deeper familiarity is really important in just all relationships. When we get close to another human being or our pet, that sense of being familiar and getting to know something in a more meaningful and in a deeper way is important. And similarly, with that attachment with planet Earth, the formation of that sort of early attachment with planet Earth requires that familiarity. And so going round and round the planet, seeing the planet in that way, was a very important part of that sort of initial formation of a stronger attachment bond.
That was something I had wondered if it was mostly, astronauts had like a sudden shift in their consciousness that happened, the first time they set eyes on Earth, or I was wondering if for some of them it took more time. So it sounds like for some astronauts it was, being in orbit for a while, seeing the Earth over an extended period of time, it kind of built up for some.
There are aspects of the engagement that are immediate, like that initial feeling of awe when they set eyes for the first time, or maybe second, third, fourth, fifth time on planet Earth from space or orbit. That's an immediate, powerful, visceral emotion that sort of takes over them, right? And so that's something that's immediate. So there's that sort of immediate perceptual and emotive engagement with the planet. But of course, there's the contemplative responses that sort of follow on afterwards as well. And I think you're right that over months and years, this process is unfolding. I don't know if you've ever had a very profound or traumatic even experience in your life. I know for any of the experiences that I've had in my life, it's ongoing, isn't it? Whether it's profound in a positive way or profound maybe initially in a negative way. The key thing is they stay with you and you go over them, and you reflect on them, and sometimes in a really healthy way and other times in a not so healthy way. But similarly with the astronauts, they thought about this experience. And for example, one wonderful story is Joseph Allen, one of my, I probably shouldn't have a favorite interview, but he was one of my favorites. He talked about dreaming of Earth years after he'd been to space. And so he was sort of talking about dreams and recurring dreams, seeing Earth, and it really was internalized for him and others in different ways. Ronald Garron talks about how he can visualize and close his eyes and bring that moment back, the feeling of unification, oneness, in the moment. And so it's quite profound, and as you rightly pointed out, it is kind of sort of incremental, and over time it unfolds and is internalized. And I think actually the attachment is strengthened in many ways over time because of this process of reflecting and contemplating, and and I just find the whole, and for me, it's really important to try to understand, we have, Bowlby and attachment theories on relationships, for example, human relationships and human attachment between mother and infant, and then relationships as adults. But actually, there are also attachments with objects that can, develop. Think of hoarding disorder, for example. We can develop strong attachments with objects. But we can also develop strong attachments with places of interest and preference. We can develop strong attachments with, natural environments. And so there's, biophilia, for example, is about that, our love for nature, our love for natural places. So I think that's important to think about how these attachments, why these attachments with planet Earth develop and are cultivated. What is the process? Because if we can understand what happens to the astronauts up there in orbit in space, we can use that knowledge and wisdom to then create effective interventions, applications, processes, educational systems, whatever it is, here on Earth. And I think that's something that has inspired me and moved me, so that I'm constantly trying to learn from the experience of the astronauts, but also now commercial astronauts, and then now VR, which I'm involved in and with.
I'm so excited to ask you about your your work in virtual reality and kind of mimicking this overview effect that astronauts experience. I'm curious, because I think this probably helps you with your research and how to create a virtual reality experience. Like, I know the 7 astronauts you spoke to, they all experienced this overview effect, but does it happen to all astronauts? And if it doesn't happen to all astronauts, have you managed to identify some of the contributing factors that might play a role on whether someone does experience this or not?
So I think we should differentiate out the overview with the effect. The overview is the planetary perspective, and everyone from orbit or space has the planetary perspective. And dependent on, their personality traits, predisposing factors, their belief systems, they all have some sort of variance in how they respond to that. So there is that. There is the common sort of feeling of awe that, again, is across the board. And I would say most, if not all, astronauts and cosmonauts comment on this feeling of awe, of being in deep space, of being seeing the planetary perspective of the rocket launch. All of these things combined, weightlessness, there's this feeling of just awe that does come over them momentarily, occasionally, but it comes and goes, and it's been reported while they're watching planet Earth as well. So that's something that's common and reported across astronauts and cosmonauts. And Gallagher and colleagues in 2015 did a neurophenomenological, if I can say that, study. And I'd advise people to look into that. And that was on space flight and awe and wonder. Their study focused in on that. The other thing we've noticed is that there is some variance in terms of astronaut values. So we talked about spirituality, and actually there's one specific type of spirituality, which is called universalism, which means all forms of nature are equally deserving of protection, appreciation, tolerance, and understanding. And that seems to be the type of spirituality that sort of the planetary perspective and the overview effects lend themselves to. However, there seems to be some variance between astronauts and cosmonauts. So, for example, cosmonauts do not affiliate or do not talk about universalism as much as Canadian and NASA astronauts. So there's cultural differences in terms of, how the experience is relayed, how the experience is processed. Maybe there's language differences there too. And so I think you're right that, we can't just make assumptions that it is the same across the board for everyone. There will be differences. But what we can do is look for these commonalities across the experience in terms of what data we have so far, and see if we can replicate those. And that's what we're trying to do.
So I love that you're currently doing research in trying to recreate the overview effect through virtual reality. Tell us a little bit about your current initiative.
So the project, or what we're called, is virtual reality overview effect. So it says what it does on the tin, in a sense. We attempt to recreate aspects of the overview effect and planetary perspective via virtual immersive environments. We combine various elements. That includes binaural beats. We also use certain sort of frequency ranges as well. We use meditation. We use the science of music and celestial scenes, and the learning that we've sort of developed based on my research as well as other people's research, like Frank White's, David Yaden's, Nick Canis, Stuster, if I can say his name. What we do is try to incorporate some of those themes into our work. So, for example, the idea of the night passes and the dark passes, the idea of familiarity, going around the earth to become more familiar, the idea of spirituality, universalism, the idea of trying to use the cosmic landscape to elicit awe. All of these kinds of ideas and themes that came about as a result of, as I said, my research and other people's work, we try to incorporate into our pilots and programs. And then what we do with the programs is we then research it. We then sort of create a hypothesis and then say, okay, right, so we hypothesize that this program can elicit awe, and can it? We hypothesize that this program can strengthen momentarily connectedness or relatedness to nature? Can it? And these types of tests with emotions, which are a bit sort of abstract and difficult to measure anyway. But that's what we're doing. And it's a learning exercise, because what we can then use the data and the outcome and the research for is this type of research can support other people's work in trying to come up with well-being initiatives on Earth and off Earth as well. And really what I'm interested at, I'm a psychologist. I'm actually a counseling psychologist, which means I work in clinical practice. I work with people directly on a relational level. And it's really important to have other ways, apart from talking therapy, to try to help people do that. So how can we help people self-regulate and co-regulate? For example, PTSD as a result of that can arise sometimes as a result of traumatic experiences. So if we can then use technology to help people do that through the music, meditation, through whatever means we can, and show through science and evidence where that is working and where it might need improvement, then who knows, in 10, 20 years' time, interventions can look very different. We might have a much broader spectrum of interventions. Of course, that leads me to think about interventions like psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and transcendent interventions generally. What a world it could be if we could have these evidence-based, evidence-led, transcendent interventions that help re-enchant people with the world, that help people calibrate and regulate, that help people in a different way than medication or some psychoactive medications or antidepressants that really have a numbing effect. So I'm very sort of passionate about trying to, even if I contribute a small, tiny piece to the puzzle of trying to give more options to people, prisoners, people, inpatients, to hospitals, to people who are depressed, we need more options on the table as treatment options, and then even also extending out to mental health or deep space missions. We need solutions for people who might be going out further out into the reaches of the cosmos, and all of these are just ideas at this stage, but there's some ideas on the table and we're trying to research it, basically.
Yeah, and it's not fair that it's just currently, the wealthy elite like Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, they currently can go to space and potentially experience this planetary perspective. But your work through virtual reality can make it accessible to everyday people. I know there's a quote on your website from one of the Apollo 14 astronauts, Michael Collins. He said, "I believe that if the political leaders of the world could see their planet from a distance, their outlook would be fundamentally changed." So imagine if all political leaders could experience this overview effect, maybe their priorities and decision-making could be fundamentally different. I know your research is in, preliminary stages, but what have you found so far? What do people experience when they do this virtual reality overview effect?
Yeah, so what we found is we've been doing beta tests we have one pilot called the Music of the Spheres, which is largely focusing on trying to recreate some of the themes in my research and trying to elicit awe. So that's the sort of key thing that we were focusing on. Can we elicit to varying degrees some awe response in people? Can we strengthen people's attachment to planet Earth, even momentarily? And can we sort of recreate those certain themes and techniques that I've alluded to in my research? So I think, have conducted some beta tests and small-scale studies so far. I think about 100 people. And they've come back sort of showing very provisional results. And I say provisional because we're just about to conduct more in-depth research with universities. But they show that there is some awe response that needs further investigation. And again, in terms of connectedness to nature, we've had positive responses, and we've used self-report measures at this stage. But as I said, we're going into much more in-depth ways of measuring emotions using perhaps biosensors and observational studies and behavioral studies as well. So that's with awe. And now we've got a VROE program for leaders that we've created, which looks at sustainable leadership, looks at circular leadership. And this is in collaboration with Charlie Perrings, who is one of the co-founder or is the co-founder of the ROE, and Egbert Mulder, who is the founder of Circular Leadership. So we've partnered up and we're trying to create programs, so virtual reality, as well as other multisensory 2D tech-based programs based on the overview effect to help support sustainable leadership. And we couple these virtual reality or 2D multisensory tech-based programs with workshops. And the workshops are very much based on, the leaders of the world, CEOs, directors, and politicians, leaders in academia. And one of the reasons why is because we thought, well, how can we create a meaningful change? And we thought, well, leaders is one of the areas that we can do that with, and it seems very relevant right now. I think leaders of companies are beginning to realize that actually the world is demanding change, and that they need to take a different tack and approach to leadership, and that's what we're offering. And sustainable leadership, approach that uses technology to help leaders develop soft skills, to help leaders come up to solutions of how they can take a more sustainable approach, how they can promote sustainability in their organizations and companies, how they can be more creative. And so that's what all of that is about. And again, we're partnering up with the university. It's provisional discussions with the University of Amsterdam to sort of conduct some research. Egbert's based in Netherlands, and we're in UK to conduct some early research with specific cohorts that participate.
Awesome. So if someone listening to this wanted to experience the virtual reality overview effect, is there currently a way for them to do that, or what would you recommend?
So there's a film festival that is on Friday 11th of March, Saturday 12th of March, Sunday 13th of March, and it's called the Overview Effect Film Festival. And we will be presenting the Music of the Spheres on the Sunday. I can't tell you the time because it's not been confirmed, but that's the Overview Effect Film Festival. So, whoever is interested in experiencing the Music of the Spheres, which I think is one of the most actually powerful programs that we've created, can come and join us there, and we'll talk about the overview effect. We'll talk about the theory of the overview effect. There'll be a panel discussion, and then there'll be a meditation and one of the pilots that we've created.
Amazing. And is that an online film festival, or is it in person?
It's an online film. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll add a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
So one other question I wanted to ask you about is I have been studying under Dr. Leela Moore, studying the connection between spirituality and technology. And so I've been doing a lot of reading about the potential for virtual reality to help cause a shift in consciousness. And I find that when I talk about this idea with people, I get met with a lot of resistance to this idea of virtual reality. And especially since Mark Zuckerberg did this announcement about Facebook and the metaverse, there seems to be a lot of fear around virtual reality. And I was wondering if you encounter that as you talk about these topics, and kind of what your take is on, the shadow side of technology, but also its positive potential as well.
So I think the reality is, with any tools that humankind have developed over our millions of years of evolution, there's always a positive and negative use of the tools. We can think of fire, we can think of technology, we can think of whatever tools that we've created, swords, and so I think that's important to bear in mind, that there will ultimately be this sort of positive and negative aspect to it. So I don't deny that there is a negative aspect. Of course, as you talked about, we've got the gaming side of, a lot of parents are worried about their children and, being addicted to games, and this whole new world that is taking over. And, certain people from the sort of 80s and 90s generation, sort of, which is my generation, aren't as familiar because, it only sort of started happening. Internet sort of came about only in the 90s. So there is a real problem. And the thing is, this positive reinforcement through dopamine, which can occur, especially with gaming, for example, also with television, any type of addiction that you can think of, really is this sort of dopamine circuitry that is activated. And that is really, it's not just about gaming, right? This is about more than gaming, but gaming is one of the things that can activate that dopamine circuitry, and then can therefore overuse can lead to addictive behaviors. And so that's the sort of gaming side of it, which again is something that might become habitual, something that becomes regular, something that becomes everyday, part of your everyday life. And I suppose the metaverse also talks about that in terms of what that might become in the future, would be sort of an internet within this immersive world, where anything can sort of be created. So I think that some caution does need to be taken with creation of, when we're architecting positive technologies, which is what I'm involved in. I think you have to be careful. I think they have to be well designed. I think you have to think about utility, what they're for, how they will be used, when they will be used, by who, do they work, how do they work, which is what VROE are. We're not perfect, but we're trying to take some of those precautionary steps in doing that. So I think those questions are very relevant and very important. And I think in terms of, recent sort of developments with Zuckerberg and metaverse is this sort of, I wouldn't call it a paranoia, actually. I would call it sort of this hypersensitivity to data and content, and these sort of larger organizations and companies having a say over that data and content and what happens to it. People are becoming very sensitive to that, including myself. Where does that data go? Who controls it? Why? And they're important questions. So I think that again, they're important questions, and I think we need to think about what drives us when we're designing. We should try to, at the heart of the mission, put well-being. I mean, that's what we're doing. We're taking this positive technology approach, and we're trying to think of the well-being, of the people we're working for. And that's at the heart of what we do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's definitely some really positive things that can come from the overview effect. Is there anything else you would like to talk about in relation to VROE and your work, or anything I haven't asked you about?
No, just I think just the research side is what we're doing at the moment. We're partnering up with a bunch of different universities internationally, and hopefully by next year we'll have some more results on top of what we have. And again, we're going to use those results to improve the programs we have. And yeah, we'll keep going and keep researching, and hopefully you'll hear from us a bit more in the future once we have more results on the programs we've created.
Fantastic. So if people want to find out more information, where should they go?
So I think our Instagram is VR_overview effect. Our website is VR-overview-effect.co.uk.
Wonderful. Well, Annahita, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I loved hearing more about your work on the overview effect. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Kaz. It was lovely talking with you about this topic.
Thanks so much for listening to today's episode. The music you hear in this podcast is composed by my friend Zachary Walter. If you want to find out more, visit zacharywaltermusic.com, and I'll see you next time.